Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Konstantinos Kourougiannis. I'm the president of CFA Society Cyprus. On behalf of our society, I'm delighted to open our Strategic Investment Insights webinar series, a new initiative designed to bring our members and the broader investment community timely, thought-provoking discussions on key developments shaping global markets. Through this series, we aim to provide access to leading experts and practitioners who will share their insights on topics that matter most to investors today, from macroeconomic trends and market dynamics to policy changes and investment strategies. Today marks the first session in this series, and we are very pleased to begin with a highly relevant and timely topic: tariffs and the global economy, risk, responses, and outlook. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Mr. Sam Jochim, economist at EFG Asset Management in London. Sam will explore how tariffs work, why they are being deployed by the Trump administration, and what policies are being designed to offset them. He will also look at what happened to Chinese exports during the first term trade war and the potential implications in the new policy landscape. Before we begin, just a few brief notes about today's session. The presentation will be followed by a Q&A session. You may submit your questions at any time in the chat section, and we will address them toward the end. Once again, thank you for joining us, and a special thanks to Sam for sharing his expertise with us today. With that, I'm pleased to hand over to our speaker, Mr. Sam Jochim. Sam, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Konstantino, and welcome everyone. It's a real pleasure to talk to you all today about tariffs and the global economy. So if you haven't heard about tariffs in 2025, I don't really know where you've been hiding. It's been a key trend for the global economy, and it's got really important implications going forward. So we'll start with a quick overview looking at what tariffs are and why President Trump is using them. So tariffs are taxes on imported goods that governments levy at the border. So when a country exports one good, for example, China exports a sofa to the US, when that sofa reaches the US port, the US government taxes the value of that sofa. So Trump has had a love affair with tariffs since the 1980s, and it's really an ideology for him. He argues that the purpose of his trade policy is to correct trade imbalances. But if you actually look at what tariffs are being used for, evidence points to something else, and it points to tariffs being used as part of a broader political strategy. So we'll talk about that all a little bit later on. So the implementation of tariffs on US trading partners really makes little economic sense, and it will have long-term implications. And we're going to talk about that as well, and how countries around the world will accelerate their thoughts that the US is no longer a reliable partner. So if we look at Trump's words at face value and who has the largest trade imbalances with the US, you'd expect these countries to also have the largest tariffs on them. So if you look at the chart on the left, you can see China here is at the top. That has the largest goods trade. That's who the US has the largest goods trade deficit with, followed by the Eurozone, Mexico, Vietnam, Ireland, Germany, and so on. On the right-hand side, you have countries that actually have a surplus in trade with the US. So that means that actually they export less to the US than the US exports to them. And you can see some notable countries on here. One I'd like to highlight is Brazil, and I'll talk about why that is a little bit later on. I've just shown the trade in goods on this chart. It's worth noting that goods really drives the US's deficit. So the chart wouldn't look too different if I also had included services trade. And for the scope of this presentation, I really just want to focus on goods. The other thing I'd like to point out on this slide is that India is not on it, and we'll come on to that in just a moment. So if we now look at the tariff rates that the US has on other countries, there's a few key things to note. So firstly, April the 2nd, obviously famous this year as Liberation Day. That's when the US imposed tariffs on so many of its trading partners, some of which were seen as key allies at the time and still are. And if we take Trump's word at face value, the countries which have the largest trade deficits with the US should also be the countries with the highest tariff rates. But if you remember, I just spoke about Brazil and India. Clearly, that's not the case. Brazil and India are the two countries with the largest tariffs imposed on them by the US at 50%. But there's different reasons for both. So for Brazil, this is Trump's way of expressing his displeasure at former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, who's a good friend of Mr. Trump, being sentenced to 27 years in prison for plotting a coup. And for India, the tariffs are secondary tariffs due to India's imports of Russian oil. That's what is reported by the US, but also supposedly a factor is that Trump is dissatisfied with Indian Prime Minister Modi because he didn't recommend Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize after Trump claimed to have stopped fighting between India and Pakistan. So clearly the tariff rates are not just a trade tool, but they're also forming part of US foreign policy. And we've become so used to that with Trump. And there's also an element of ego in there, particularly when we think about the India tariffs. The other element to tariffs is fiscal policy. So this is a new fiscal strategy from an old playbook. So the third bullet point here is a quote from President Trump. It says, "We were at our richest from 1870 to 1913. That's when we were a tariff country. And then they went to an income tax concept. And we're shown in the chart on the top left here that that is true. During that time frame, the US relied heavily on customs duties as its federal government income, and it had no permanent income tax, but it really overlooks some important facts. So actually, income taxes were introduced temporarily during this time frame to finance the Civil War. The economy suffered two severe downturns in 1873 and 1893, and this was also a period that was characterized by significant inequality and social unrest, rather than broadly shared prosperity that Trump would have you believe. So when tariffs were the main source of federal government income, it was actually because they were easier to collect than taxes. And the shift to income taxation in the 1900s was really driven by the US's need to finance World War I and raise revenues for social insurance and retirement programs. So while tariffs revenues are increasing at the moment, you can see that in the chart on the right. They've risen $19 billion from last year, and that does partially offset the cost of recent tax cuts, particularly from Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which we'll talk about later on. It's clearly not feasible for tariffs to become the main source of federal government revenue as they were in the 1800s. So another important trend we're seeing with the latest round of US tariffs is implementation issues. This has some really important consequences for the economy. So just going into those, implementation really is not proving easy this time around. So for a long time, as I've shown on the chart on the right, the US reported that it imported a higher value of goods from China than China reportedly exported to the US. So that chart on the right shows Chinese exports to the US minus US imports from China. And I've taken a 12-month average just because that series is quite volatile. So it made sense that the US reported that it imported more from China because exports are recorded as free on board, while imports, so what the US was recording, also included the cost of insurance and shipping of goods to the US. But you can see there was a swing in that chart around 2017 when Trump first imposed tariffs on China. And really one factor contributing to this is invoicing strategies by US firms. So reportedly now US firms are reporting that they are importing less from China. And the reason they're doing so is so that they pay less in tariffs to the US government. There are other implementation difficulties being reported in the media, and these are really notably due to tariff engineering. So a couple of key things I'd like to talk about. One is dismantling of goods. The notable example that I've seen is Delta Airlines, which has been removing brand new engines from Airbus jets in Europe and shipping them to the US in order to avoid the tariffs on the complete aircraft. And they avoid that tariff because the engines themselves are manufactured in the US. And there's reports of other companies doing similar things. Also, companies have been reclassifying products. I haven't got an example from this time around, but actually looking back almost 20 years, It's quite a famous case of Converse, who produced shoes, and they included a layer of fuzzy felt at the bottom of their shoe, and that allowed their shoes to be classified as slippers rather than athletic shoes, which meant that they faced a lower tariff rate. So these are some of the strategies that companies which are quite crafty are using to dodge tariffs. The other thing that was really a key trend at the start of the year was front loading. So front loading of imports, which has really limited the initial impact of tariffs. So you can see on the chart on the left, I've plotted the monthly change in manufacturing inventories in the US. This is real change, so it counts for inflation. And I've looked at the data going back to 2010, and the increase in inventories in March, so this big spike that we saw there, was the largest outside of the pandemic. And the pandemic obviously was when companies accelerated inventory buildup of goods due to high demand when there were lockdowns, but then the economy reopened and it clearly backfired. This time around, it was companies stockpiling imports. You can see that because on the chart on the right, US imports also spikes really significantly in March. And they did that to dodge higher costs due to the potential imposition of tariffs. And that matters because companies tend not to pass on cost increases until inventories that they've purchased at lower costs have been run down. So this creates a lag between the implementation of tariffs and when their impact begins to show up in data. Now, on top of front loading and tariff engineering, among other factors, it means that the actual effective tariff rate is much lower than the announced effective tariff rate. So if you look at the chart on the right, the actual effective tariff rate is the duty paid on imports at customs as a share of the value of imports. And the effective tariff rate is based on the announced tariffs, and it's calculated as a weighted average using pre-substitution trade weights. So as you can see, the effective tariff is the higher rate in the chart on the right, and that shows that a substitution has occurred, and consumers and producers in the US have switched to alternate goods and inputs which are subject to lower tariff rates or are domestically improved. So if you take all of those factors together, it means that the impact of tariffs on macroeconomic data has so far been subdued. And that's really driven by tariffs being lower due to import substitution, implementation difficulties such as lower invoicing and tariff engineering, and it's also being driven by lags due to front loading. But when we do start to see it in the data, what should we expect? So if we look now at the economic impact, actually it is visible if you know where to look. So in the chart on the left there, I've plotted the PCE price index in year-on-year terms. So this is the inflation measure that the US central bank, the Federal Reserve, prefers to look at. And I've plotted the headline index and also the durable goods index. And this was a point made in a speech recently by Kansas City President, Fed President Jeff Schmidt, who said that inflation remains too high in the US. You can see that it's above the 2% inflation target. And he also noted that durable goods inflation is not at a level consistent with the Fed's 2% target for overall inflation. So if you look back to 1996 in that chart, you can see that headline inflation is volatile, but by and large has hovered around that 2% level. At the same time, durable goods inflation has been around negative 2% on average. Currently, we have durable goods inflation at 1%. That's the highest in over 30 years outside of the pandemic. So what that means in his view is that inflation is not at a level where the Fed should be cutting rates more. And he did vote for a rate cut at the Fed's last meeting, but noted that because of this, he wouldn't be voting for one at the meeting next week. There's also a study by the Harvard Pricing Lab that provides evidence that imported goods have increased price more than US country of origin goods. And I've shown that in the chart on the right there. That's taken from this study. And what they did was they tracked pricing data for 5 major US retailers for which detailed country of origin data could be gathered. And where that information was missing, they used AI to predict the country of origin, which I thought was quite interesting. So the first tariff announcement on China on February the 4th had little impact on prices, but the announcements that followed raised prices at these 5 major stores. But I think what's interesting is that prices increased both for imported goods, but also to a lesser extent for domestic goods, since many US-made products rely on imported imports, but also because of competitive pricing strategies from firms. And you can see that relative to the size of the tariff, so the increase in goods prices has been relatively small. And in addition, the factors that we've already spoken about, the paper notes that this is due to margin reduction. So some firms are footing the cost of tariffs at the moment. And there's also trade diversions going on, which we'll speak about a little bit later. If we look then at the employment data, on the top right, I've plotted non-farm employment over the last 2 years. And you can see the gold line is total employment. I've indexed this so that it's 100 in March 2025. And you can see the gold line's been growing consistently, and that's really been driven by the services sector, while goods producing employment has been broadly flat over that time and then started to decline after March. And these are the sectors that you'd expect to be most exposed to tariffs. So wholesale trade, manufacturing, those turned negative in March when we started to see tariffs really enter the news. At the same time, those services employment continued to grow. It's too early to draw conclusions about whether this is due to tariffs or just a coincidence or something else, but it is consistent with the inflation data that I presented on the previous slide. In addition, a couple of weeks ago, the Fed released their October Beige Book. This just gathers anecdotal evidence across lots of different states on the state of the economy. And I thought there was some interesting quotes in there. The one that I've got on this slide shows that some firms kept headcount steady due to uncertainty, while others shed workers to offset tariff-related cost increases. So anecdotal evidence is showing that firms are cutting workers or just holding them steady and holding off on hiring due to tariffs and due to uncertainty. And just to illustrate that, I've plotted an uncertainty index on the bottom right. And you can see that we had a spike during the pandemic, and we've also had a spike when Trump came in and due to tariffs, and those spikes absolutely dwarf all of the data that we've seen since 1985. So the long run impact could be meaningful. The Tax Foundation, which is a non-partisan organization, so it's non-biased, it doesn't lean towards the Democrats or the Republicans. They've got some estimates, I've put them in the table on the right. They believe that Section 232 tariffs are expected to reduce long-run GDP by 0.2%. So these are tariffs on specific products or sectors that threaten US national security. And we also have IEEPA, or the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and these are broad-based tariffs. So the broad tariffs that we've seen on all exports from some countries, that's IEEPA tariffs, and they're based on national emergency declarations. And the Supreme Court will be hearing arguments next month as to whether these are constitutional or whether indeed President Trump is overstepping his power there. So we don't know whether these will hold or not, but if they do, the Tax Foundation says that they will reduce long-run GDP by an additional 0.7%. So the expected retaliation by US trading partners then is also estimated to affect US imports, further reducing GDP. And you can look at different estimates by different organizations, but they all point to tariffs being bad for the economy. They point to them being inflationary, being bad for the labor market, and bad for GDP. And if you look at the little darker table at the bottom right, the 2018 to 2019 trade war tariffs, this is the estimated impact. You can see that long-run GDP was estimated to be hit by 0.2%. So the impact now is clearly much larger than that at 1.1%, because also the trade war has expanded much more than it was in Trump's first term. There are some potential offsets though, and I think these are worth talking about. The first one is lower oil prices. So over the course of the year, we've seen oil prices drop by around $20 per barrel. And in his testimony to the Senate Banking Committee in March 2022, Fed Chair Powell gave a rule of thumb saying that for every $10 increase in oil prices, that raises inflation by about 0.2% and lowers growth by about 0.1%. So if you take that and flip it, the $20 decrease in the oil price would imply a positive impact on growth between 0.2 and 0.8%, and a negative impact of inflation between 0.4 and 1% over the long run. And that's clearly going to provide a helpful offset to the impact of tariffs. And it may have been behind Trump's drill baby drill mantra when he was campaigning last year to become president. The other potential offset is the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. I was talking about this earlier in the presentation. So this really is about tax cuts. It makes some of them permanent. I won't go through everything on this slide, but I think the really important thing to me is that it makes permanent the 100% bonus depreciation for short-lived assets. So that means that businesses are able to immediately lower their taxable income, and that incentivizes investment and boosts GDP growth through this channel. If we move on then to what I really want to talk about, this is my area of expertise, which is China. And I think this is really one of the most interesting things about this trade war, the US-China tensions, which have escalated in the past couple of weeks, just in time for my presentation, which was very kind of Presidents Xi and Trump to bear me in mind. But if you look on this slide here, you can see that US-China trade tensions have really escalated in 2025. The chart I show here just starts at February, which was when the US first imposed 10% additional tariffs. And since then, there was a lot of volatility. We saw a spike to a level that both sides knew was unsustainable. Actually, US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent came out to the media and said, this is unsustainable. And after that, we saw de-escalation. And so far, that's broadly persisted. So since that early volatility, the tariff rates since the middle of May have broadly been flat and at a much lower level than since the spike. There have been spikes in tensions, but these have been short-lived, and they're actually taking place in the form of export controls rather than tariff increases now, which I think is interesting. So if we take a step back and look at the longer term trend, from 1993 to 2020 to 2016, the US was on average the destination for 19% of Chinese goods exports. And I think that's really interesting. There was a notable spike after China formally applied to join the World Trade Organization in 1995, and then when it officially joined in 2001, but on average, it's been 19%. And then when Trump first entered the White House and put tariffs on China, we saw that drop pretty significantly. So a real ramp up in tariffs, and the share of Chinese goods exports to the US decreased. It's now below 12%. So you would expect under those circumstances that China's share of world exports fell because its exports to its largest trade partner also fell. But in fact, if you look at the chart on the right, you can see that China's share of world exports have actually increased since Trump's first term. And what that represents is a diversification of where China is sending its goods. So we can talk about transshipments because the exports to ASEAN economies have really increased significantly. But that doesn't account for everything. So it's not the main driver. It's something that the US is actually combating with 40% tariffs due to transshipments. But I think what's really key here, you can see this really significant decline in exports to the US and a trade reorientation, particularly to Latin America and to ASEAN economies. And I don't have Africa on here, but you'd see the same thing for Africa as well. But that trade reorientation has had significant implications for many of these economies. So the term China shock was first used in the 90s to describe the impact of the rise in China's share of US imports on its labor market. And you can see in the chart on the right there, I've plotted the US's good imports from China as a percentage of GDP. That's on the right-hand side. And as it increases at the same time, the percentage of the US working age population that is made up of manufacturing employment is decreasing. So that had a really significant impact on the US labor market. It's another reason that Trump's imposed these tariffs this time around. He's talking about protectionism and protecting these industries. But we're now seeing similar things happen in Southeast Asian economies. And one example that I could give you is Indonesia, where in the textiles market, the textiles companies cannot compete with Chinese prices, and some of those companies are going bust, and that's leading to mass layoffs. So in March this year, one of the major textile producers went bust, and that led to 11,000 layoffs in 1 month. So it really has significant implications. I did write a note on this earlier in the year, just highlighting, there's a nice ancient African proverb that when the elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. So when the US and China are fighting, actually, it's often the smaller economies around them where trade is being sent to that suffer. Now, it's impossible to talk about the relationship between China and the US without talking about AI, which has really become an arms race. So I've got a chart here showing AI investment, which is completely dominated by the US. Over the last 10 years, $470 billion of US investment dwarfs all the competition. The only one remotely keeping pace is China, which has 120 billion. It's really not clear to me who's going to win the AI race. It's not clear that the US necessarily will do. I think the US clearly has the chips advantage at the moment, but China has the power advantage. And I just wanted to finish on this slide then, which was put together by one of our tech analysts, and I think is a really brilliant slide. So it highlights the importance of this to both governments. So the US government has taken a stake in Intel. You've seen large CapEx announcements from Chinese companies related to AI. And what's really remarkable to me is that all of this on this slide has happened during the space of 1 month. So we've seen recent escalations of trade tensions because of China's export controls on rare earths. We saw previous escalations because of US export controls on advanced chips. I think, as I said, the US clearly has the chips advantage, China has the power advantage, but it's going to be a really, really important space to watch in the coming years. And I think trade policy is going to form a really key part of this. So I think with that, I'll stop there and just open the floor to any questions.
Thank you very much, Sam, for this very informative and insightful presentation on tariffs. This topic will undoubtedly continue to shape the influence markets in the years ahead. It's good to see from your presentation that tariff is a tool of foreign policy, not only in the financial sense. Challenges in implementation versus just announcing more and more tariffs. Very innovative methods of avoiding tariffs. Good to see, important to see the longer impacts of tariffs, and also interesting to see the history of US-China trade tensions, as well as where the Chinese exports are transferred following the implementation of these tariffs. So now we'll start our Q&A session. I will first go to a question that we received from the attendees during the registrations. I want to encourage all of you to write your questions in the chat to give them to Sam to respond. So the first question is, what indicators should investors monitor to track whether tariff escalation is easing or worsening?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think when we look at economic data, any individual data point can kind of skew our analysis and can introduce bias towards our views. So it's important not to just look at one individual thing, but to kind of take lots of different data points and kind of use them to piece together a mosaic. But I think in general, with tariffs, there's no one indicator. I think news flow is the best thing. Announcements out of Washington or Beijing, press conferences and interviews with Trump or best, and they've been very outspoken, and they really don't hide the direction of travel for this. So I think if you're looking at the next 2 weeks, we have two really, really key watch points. We have Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng meeting with US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent in Malaysia. And that's going to set the tone for a meeting between Presidents Trump and Xi on the sidelines of the APEC forum in South Korea next week. So those would be the two key watch points. But if you want the tongue-in-cheek answer, just track President Trump's Truth Social posts.
Thank you, Sam. So the next question is US-China tariff war the new norm? Do you think the spikes of threats followed by some agreement expected to continue as a form of political play between the two? Or do you think a signed deal will be made in the near future? This is from the audience.
I thought if I had to hang my hat on one answer, I'd say I'd expect some kind of deal. But when you think about trade deals, these take years and years to hammer out over the negotiating table. The deals that we've actually seen recently between individual countries in the US, you can think of the UK and US deal, for example, or the EU-US trade deal. Those are not actually proper trade deals. They're just kind of bilateral agreements, and they're quite easy to renege on. So I think in terms of getting something more substantial, we're years away from getting there. The US and China are on very different paths. They don't really agree on a lot of foreign policy and economic policy. And there's also this AI race going on. So I think they want to avoid flashpoints that become completely economically unsustainable. So where we had tariffs at 145% this year, we quickly saw a de-escalation from there. So it is possible we continue to get these spikes. I do think we'll likely get some kind of deal that leads to continued de-escalation. But I think it's impossible to say actually that that's going to last for a very long time.
Yeah, it's important from your presentation as well that there is a history of US-China trade war, not only when Trump started this trade war and was the president of the US.
Yeah.
So the next question. Do you think these tariffs will follow classic economic theory that US firms are generally better off, but the consumer loses out with an overall welfare loss?
I would argue that economic theory would not just make US firms better off. I think in the short term, you do get these short-lived kind of impacts on trade flows, but I think those actually usually fade after a few years because you get substitutions and other factors also continue to kind of take hold. So if you applied tariffs to just one country, you might get a competitive advantage between other countries that don't have tariffs on them. But I think when you apply broad-based tariffs in the long term, then actually kind of deeper macroeconomic forces like productivity differences, gaps between domestic savings and investment, and not just trade policy alone start to take effect. And then you have to look at things like the negative impact tariffs can have on businesses. And when you have tariffs and US firms are facing reduced competitiveness with firms abroad, then actually they're less entrepreneurial, they're less innovative, and they make lower productivity gains. So actually, I would argue that over the long run, they would then become less competitive with foreign companies, despite tariffs. But I agree that the consumer loses out in any situation with tariffs.
Some questions from my side to allow more time to get more questions.
Sure.
So to what extent do tariffs still serve as an effective tool for correcting trade imbalances?
So I guess the empirical evidence shows that they do produce a short-lived impact on trade flows, but that does usually fade after a few years as substitutions and other factors take hold. And then, as I just spoke about, there's kind of deeper macroeconomic forces at play, productivity differences, gaps between domestic and savings and investment. And I think when all of those factors take hold, actually tariffs are very unlikely to correct trade imbalances. Maybe in the short term, they could have a little spike in that, but over the long run, I think they're really not impactful.
The next question corresponds to implementation and challenges. Are there any sectors that have managed to adapt successfully to the new tariff environment?
So there are good cases of individual companies adapting to tariffs, but companies within sectors behave asymmetrically. So it's a really good question. It's one that's difficult to answer. The best examples I've seen within entire sectors is the home furnishing sector in the US. So companies have managed to reduce their supply chain exposure to China there and diversify to countries like Vietnam and India. But I would just note that I think that's a sector which is able to diversify due to the presence of alternate supplies and competitive pricing in that space. And other sectors really don't have that luxury.
The next one is for regarding the economic and market impact of tariffs. How have investors and markets priced in the renewed trade tensions?
Another good question. So I think the immediate reaction has kind of been textbook. So we've seen sharp sell-offs in equities, bonds have rallied, safe haven assets such as gold have been very strong. But then as you've kind of seen de-escalation, those equities, for example, have recovered. And if you look at market performance year to date, it would suggest actually investors generally expect the de-escalatory narrative to prevail and the overall impact to be quite small. And as I mentioned, we'll get some important watch points this week with the meeting between Besant and Li Feng, and then next week with the meeting between Trump and Xi. So it'll be important to see the market reaction to those.
Next question from the audience. Do you think China will catch up with chip technology in the next 5 years? If yes, how will this affect tariffs?
I think the time frame of 5 years is probably a little bit too short for that to happen. I'd be looking a little bit more longer term than that. It's an interesting question because China can't produce the same advanced chips that the US can at the moment. But as I mentioned, the US has export controls which are restricting China's access to those. So if you think over the long term, if you're having your access to those restricted, you're going to work on a strategy to be able to produce them yourself. So as much as the US is alienating China at the moment, actually that's probably driving China towards being self-sufficient in that space. But it's complicated technology, and I think 5 years is too short a time frame. Obviously, if and when that does happen, then tariffs become much less of an effective tool on the negotiating table for Trump. I actually think China kind of has a key trump card now, which is its complete dominance of rare earths and the rare earth supply chain. You've seen when China has restricted its exports of rare earths, that's when Trump has that's really been the US's pain point, and that's when Trump started to concede and kind of take a more de-escalatory tone. So I think actually China is one of the few countries that can stand up to the US in that matter.
The next question corresponds to FX market. How do you think what will happen to the dollar in the next quarter? I guess related to tariffs or?
In the next quarter, it's very, very difficult to forecast FX over that time frame.
Yeah, maybe we can look at it in correlation with the tariffs and how.
Yeah, I mean, you've seen since tariffs have been implemented that the dollar has depreciated. We as a firm think the dollar's in a longer term bear market, which could last for at least 10 years. I think the US's foreign policy this year has actually negotiated that. As I said at the start, it's no longer seen as a completely reliable partner in the way that it was before. Over the next quarter, given what's already happened this year, actually we could see some consolidation. We could even see a year where the dollar actually appreciates, but definitely over the longer trend, we think it's in a bear market now and will continue to depreciate.
Okay, thank you for this. Next question from my side with regards to global and strategic dimensions. Is there evidence that global supply chains are being permanently reshaped by these trade tensions?
So that's a really difficult question to answer as well. I'm going to take the easy way out and say that it's too early to tell. If you were to force me into an answer, I'd say yes, but perhaps not in the way one would expect. So what I mean by that is when we think about tariffs as they are today, the rates that the US imposes on other countries are not actually so different that they provide any one country with an extreme competitive advantage. So in that sense, I don't think there's too many permanent shifts occurring. The one I can think of off the top of my head is actually China's imports of soybeans. So before Trump took office, China imported around 40% of its soybeans from the US. And it was a major export market for the US, so it's irked Trump quite recently. Right now, that's declined to around 30%, and Brazil has picked up the slack. So that's just an example. I guess my final answer would be supply chains haven't shifted to cut anyone out completely, but they have diversified, and that could well be a permanent feature, yeah.
Another good question. Do you think, from the audience, do you think tariffs would have come anyway, irrespective of Trump, as a way to reduce US debt and are here to stay? So how effective are basically tariffs with the US debt? Because this was the initial goal, I guess.
It was the initial goal he stated. I don't think it was really the initial goal. Um, I I don't think they would have come without Trump. This is really a Trump ideology. I think the sentiment towards China, for example, is bipartisan. I don't think that is dependent on Trump. Actually, when Trump finishes his term, I think we're probably likely to see JD Vance take leadership of the Republican Party. And if anything, he's more hawkish on China than Trump. So, I think some measures are bipartisan, but tariffs themselves as a policy tool, I don't think those are. I'd imagine that if we had um, a democratic government, then no, we probably wouldn't have seen tariffs, and not just on China, but particularly on some countries that the US really views as key allies, like the UK, European Union. I think there's no way that a non-Trump government would have imposed tariffs on those.
Yes, but we have also seen that after the first administration of Trump, Democrats kept the tariffs.
Yeah, exactly. But on China.
Yeah, okay. So another question from my side with regards to broader policy and investment takeaways. Do you think protectionism will remain a long-term feature of US policy regardless of administration?
So I guess this links to the answer I just gave, which is
Yeah.
that for many countries, for me, it's a coin toss whether this gets kept afterwards. I think it wouldn't have been imposed by other administrations, but now it's here, it could well stay. But for China, the emphatic answer to this question is yes. I think something that's often overlooked, as you just mentioned, is that while Trump was the one who ramped up tariffs in his first term as president, Biden actually was the one who made those tariffs permanent, and he actually also raised some of those tariffs. And you saw on the campaign trail for the 2024 presidential election, one thing that became clear to anyone following that was that anti-China policies are really popular in the US. They view China as the main threat to US economic dominance and to the idea of US exceptionalism. So really in that sense, yes, anti-China policies are bipartisan, protectionism against China is bipartisan, and that will remain a feature permanently for years to come. Whether it remains the case for the protectionism against other countries, I think that remains to be seen as a really key question.
So with another question. Equity markets have held up well this year despite a brief sell-off after Liberation Day. Do you think we are due a market correction as the impact of tariffs continues to come through?
I think it depends on your view on what the impact of tariffs will be. As I showed in the data, it's not really come through in a big way. It's come through in some key sectors, particularly for the manufacturing sector in the US, but actually the US economy is really services dominated. So the broader macro impact might be quite small. I would argue that's what markets are pricing in right now, and they're also pricing in further de-escalation between the US and China. So if you think that that's the status quo and that holds as the base case, then I think you're not necessarily due a correction. I think if you think that something's going to go wrong in the macro data, or that actually we will see further escalation, then yeah, we probably are due a correction in that sense. I think obviously there's also a lot of other factors that impact markets. It's not all just about tariffs.
Another question. A lot of economists talk of an America alone world, where China would potentially lead in setting trade policies. What is your view?
It's a really interesting point. I think the US has alienated a lot of its allies this year with its policies. As I mentioned, is no longer seen as reliable. Whether that sees countries drift towards China remains to be seen. We've not seen it with some countries. We have with some others, notably the BRICS. The BRICS group of countries are expanding. They're talking about trading more together and kind of trying to create a group that rivals the West, which is obviously led by the US. But I think China also risks doing similar things and alienating trade partners as well. We saw last week it had its rare earths export controls on, and that really actually impacts the European Union more than it impacts the US. The US was the one that responded. Trump threatened 100% tariffs, but these rare earths are really crucial for military equipment. China has a complete dominance on the supply chain. So if they're restricting export controls for the purpose of military equipment, then the EU might really struggle to support Ukraine in the war against Russia. So I think it's not just the US alienating people at the moment. I think it's both the US and China. So from my side, I don't see a drift towards China as such, but perhaps a drift away from both the US and China.
You have more questions. Uh, what is the expected impact on US budget when factoring in the increase in spending through the One Big Beautiful Bill and the lack of implementation tariffs you mentioned, i.e. passing on higher prices to the consumer?
So I had a slide on this if I can go back to it. So One Big Beautiful Bill, on the right hand side, the darker blue table here, you can see the estimated impact by the Tax Foundation, which is another non-partisan organization. You can see that it's quite negative. One thing I would note, the Trump administration has this kind of North Star of 6% nominal GDP growth. Seems very difficult to reach. They kind of plan on reaching that, not this year or next year, but in 5 to 10 years. And if you do get that, then actually purely through higher nominal GDP growth and therefore higher tax revenue, you do start bringing the deficit down. So that's the Trump administration's plan to deal with the deficit. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act is bad for the deficit. As shown here, it's about 4 trillion worse off. I think, yeah, that's a whole other subject which we could get into maybe at another point, because I could talk for days about the US deficit and the ways to deal with that. I'd note that actually a US default kind of seems unthinkable to everyone, but actually in the 1930s, the US already did partially default on some debt. So it's another subject.
Yeah. So with this, we conclude our Q&A session. Would you like one more? So, the last one.
Yeah, sure.
How do you think the European Union, including UK, should respond to the current situation in order to remain competitive and minimize any potential negative impacts?
I think this is kind of about making, well, for the UK and European Union, I think they should be actually becoming closer together. We have already seen that this year. I think currently relationships between the two are at the most positive they've been since Brexit. But then also about kind of, as an economist, you step back and look at the theory, and the most efficient way to be competitive is free trade and kind of innovation to drive productivity. So you need to be leaders in the AI space. The chart I showed you towards the end, if I just bring it up now, shows that the UK is up there in terms of AI investment, Germany and France as well. I think that's important and is a trend that needs to intensify and continue. And also trade agreements with other countries that aren't China and the US. You know that the UK struck one with India, which is one of the fastest and largest growing economies in the world. So I think kind of trends like that are really important. But for the EU and the UK, I think the big crisis it faces at the moment is its lack of productivity growth. So I think the key to remaining competitive will be to spur productivity in those countries.
So Sam, would you like to proceed with some closing remarks before closing the webinar?
Sure, I'd just like to reiterate my thanks for having me. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you all today. I think this is going to be a really important trend to follow over the coming years. It's quite a volatile space, but if you look at the longer term trends, it's one where the US is alienating a lot of its allies, particularly under the Trump administration. Policy is becoming more and more extreme, and it's a more bipolar world. So I think it's a space to keep watching. That's definitely what we'll be doing, because it will have really important investment implications in the future.
So thank you very much, Sam, for your thoughtful answers and for sharing such valuable insights with us today. I would also like to thank all of you for joining us for the first session of the Strategic Investment Insights webinar series. Your engagement and participation make these discussions truly meaningful. We look forward to welcome you again in our upcoming sessions, where we will continue exploring major trends shaping markets and the investment landscape. So on behalf of CFA Society Cyprus, thank you once again for being with us this evening. Have a great night and see you again at our next webinar. Good night, everyone.